Hello and welcome to Capitol Crossfire. The midterms are almost fully over, but the Georgia runoff and Donald Trump's campaign announcement are still giving us a lot to talk about. Election trends appear to be shifting for voters on both sides of the aisle. And what happened in Arizona, Pennsylvania, and other close elections? Today, we're joined by Nicholas Anastacio, Nick Fattizzo, and Jacob Khabie to discuss these and more. Today, we're going to actually start with Jacob, who will go over late election calls in Arizona, Nevada, Pennsylvania, and Georgia.
Hi, Emmanuelle. Thank you for having me back. So these midterms left us wondering on whether or not the supposed red wave actually happened. As a reminder, the party of the president never really does well in the first midterm. In 2018, Donald Trump and the Republicans lost 42 seats in the House. In 2010, Barack Obama and the Democrats lost 63 seats in the House. So one would imagine that Joe Biden, who has an approval rate of 41%, historically low, would face a similar fate. But he really didn't. Yes, the Republicans did win the House, but it was not by the margin that they expected. 1 year ago, Minority Leader and possibly soon-to-be Speaker Kevin McCarthy famously predicted that he wanted to win over 60 seats back in the House. That actual number is looking more like 10 or 15. That being said, Democrats retain the Senate and could potentially expand on their majority depending on what happens in the Georgia runoff. Democrats flipped 3 gubernatorial seats, and they achieved Democratic trifectas, as in they won the governor, the state house, and the state senate in Maryland, Massachusetts, Michigan, and Minnesota. That being said, it wasn't an amazing night for Democrats. They did lose the House, so that federal Democratic trifecta has been broken. So the Biden administration is left with a House that's unlikely to be super cooperative with any of the agenda that they want to pass in the next 2 years. The last thing I want to point out before we get into results is that there was a lot of split ticketing in this election, as in people who voted for one party in one way in one race and another party in a different race. Then we should definitely be watching out for that in the Senate and governor races, which I will get into right now. So let's start with the state of Pennsylvania. In the Senate race, John Fetterman beat Mehmet Oz. This was the only Senate flip of the night, as retiring Senator Pat Toomey is a Republican. And this victory was key in retaining or even expanding the Senate majority. Fetterman won by 4.5 points, which outperformed Joe Biden's victory margin in Pennsylvania in 2020. He won by 1.2 points. He also outperformed Joe Biden in many counties. The county that I want to point out today is Allegheny County. That's where Braddock, Pennsylvania is, the city that John Fetterman was mayor of. It's also where Pittsburgh is. As you could see, John Fetterman won by 28 points. Joe Biden only won that county by 20 points in 2020. So that was a really good performance from John Fetterman. And speaking of good performances, Josh Shapiro beat Doug Mastriano for the governor's race in Pennsylvania. He outperformed both John Fetterman and Joe Biden. He won by 14.4 points, and he also flipped 3 counties that neither John Fetterman nor Joe Biden won. Those being Beaver County up here, Beaver County right here, Luzerne County up here, and Cumberland County right down here. Oh, that's not Cumberland. Cumberland County right here. All 3 of those counties, neither Joe Biden nor John Fetterman won, but Josh Shapiro did, so a really good showing from him. Moving on to Georgia, in the Senate race, Raphael Warnock and Herschel Walker are advancing to a runoff, which will take place on December 6th. Warnock came 0.6 points away from a runoff, however, he was not able to avoid it. That being said, he did get more votes from Walker. He beat him by around 1 point. If this sounds familiar, yes, this is the second time that Raphael Warnock is advancing to a runoff like he did in 2020. However, the stakes are a bit different this time. This time, Senate control isn't a factor. This time, he doesn't have another person to run with. Jon Ossoff already won his seat. So, that being said, the 51st vote in the Senate could still be very valuable to the Democrats and to the Republicans. So, this is definitely a race to watch on December 6th. And for the governor's race, Brian Kemp defeated Stacey Abrams in their 2018 rematch. Brian Kemp actually improved on his margins from 2018. In 2018, he won by 1.8 points. This last time, he won by 7.5 points. Really great showing from Kemp. Not so great from Abrams. She underperformed not only herself in 2018, but also Joe Biden in 2020. A great example of this is Fulton County. This is Georgia's most populous county. It's where Atlanta is. In 2018, Stacey Abrams won this county by 46 points. In 2020, Joe Biden also won it by 46 points. And in 2022, Stacey Abrams only won it by 38 points, which could be a disappointing showing for her. I also would like to point out that Again, this is another one of those states where we're seeing a lot of split ticketing, a lot of people who voted for Brian Kemp and voted for Raphael Warnock, which isn't really to be expected in such a partisan environment like we have today, but still an interesting thing to point out. In Arizona, Mark Kelly fended off Blake Mark Kelly fended off Blake Masters and won and defended his Senate seat. He won a full term this time. As you recall, he ran in 2020 in a special election to fill the seat of John McCain, who is a Republican. He won by 5 points, doubling his margin from 2020 and beating Joe Biden's margin of 0.3 points in Arizona. So great showing from Mark Kelly. And this improvement mostly shows in the Maricopa County, again, Arizona's most populous county. In 2020, he won that county by 3.9 points. This time around, he won it by 8 points. And in the governor's race in Arizona, Katie Hobbs defeated Kari Lake. Katie Hobbs is the Secretary of State of Arizona, so she's definitely familiar to statewide elections. This is also a gubernatorial flip. I believe the only not the only gubernatorial flip of the night, but it is a gubernatorial flip. Current Governor Doug Ducey is a Republican. This is a very slim win for Hobbs. She won by less than 1 point, and that indicates, again, the presence of a lot of people who voted for Kari Lake and then voted for Mark Kelly. And Kari Lake, who made denying the 2020 election a key part of her campaign, has yet to concede. And finally, in the state of Nevada, Catherine Cortez Masto successfully defended her seat in the Senate against Adam Laxalt. Wrong state. Nevada. I promise I know my geography. She fended off her seat from Adam Laxalt. Catherine Cortez Masto was definitely one of the more vulnerable Democratic senators, and it shows in these margins. She won by only 0.89 points. She underperformed Joe Biden's 2020 margin of 2.4 points. That being said, she still won. So this is a really key win for Democrats in retaining that majority. And in the governor's race, speaking of split ticketing, Joe Lombardo beat Steve Sisolak, a Republican. So we have a Republican and a Democrat both winning on statewide levels. Sisolak was actually the only incumbent governor to lose re-election this cycle, pending the results in Alaska, which are very much leaning in the incumbent's favor. Lombardo won by 1.4 points, so still a slim margin. And one thing that I want to point out with the Nevada races in general is that Democrats won in the same county, so both won in Clark County and in Washoe County up here, and Republicans won in all the other counties. But again, there was still that difference. A Republican won and a Democrat won. So why is that? It's because of the margins in those votes. So for example, in Clark County down here, Steve Sisolak won that county by 6 points. Catherine Cortez Masto won it by 8. In Washoe County, Steve Sisolak won that county by 1.3 points. Catherine Cortez Masto won that by 4. And in Douglas County, the most populous county that went Republican, Adam Laxalt, who lost, only won that county by 32 points. Joe Lombardo won it by 34. So while these margins may seem insignificant, they're what put a Democrat over the top in one race and a Republican over the top in the other. And yeah, that's all I got. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Jacob. So to discuss this, we're going to go with Nicholas and Nick, the Nicks, for our panel today. So like Jacob said, the Georgia election still hasn't been decided, with incumbent Senator Raphael Warnock and Herschel Walker going to a runoff on December 6th. The margin was incredibly slim, around 1%, like we heard. Who do you think is going to emerge with that Senate seat?
I think that Warnock will definitely have the edge going in. I think Walker definitely benefited with Kemp on the top of the ticket. I think now knowing that the Democrats have controlled the Senate, that does affect the race a little bit more. But Georgia is still a battleground state. We don't know what's necessarily going to happen. Also, we're playing on different runoff territory. In 2021, following the 2020 election, the runoff was in January of 2021. Now the runoff is in December of 2022 following a November 2022 election. So I do think that it's different playing fields, but I think Warnock will have an edge in the race.
Nick?
Definitely agree with my panelists. I think Donald Trump actually did the Democrats a pretty big favor in his bid announcement. One of his sessions was all about how the Republicans need to get behind Herschel Walker. But if you're Herschel Walker, you don't want to get tied to Donald Trump at this point. That's something that's working against you, because Donald Trump is a big motivating factor for the Democrats to go out and vote against you. What Republicans in Georgia couldn't necessarily do is tie Raphael Warnock to Joe Biden. But we've been able to tie Donald Trump to Herschel Walker. Brian Kemp is not going to be at the top of the ticket, who outperformed Herschel Walker. So yeah, I definitely have to agree.
And with that, do you think that Trump should have waited until the runoff to announce his campaign?
I think he honestly made the better judgment to not even announce it before the midterm elections. There was pending talks that he was going to announce his run for the presidency again, even before the midterm elections, but it's very much apparent that that was delayed to reduce any casualties on that part. But even in terms of the runoff, I mean, once again, I think we should just wait and see how the results are. And then from there, we could see if the announcement had a negative result, a positive result, or no result at all.
Well, I think Donald Trump made the announcement in mind that he was going to have had a good night. The Republican Party, there would have been a red wave, would have taken the House with a much larger margin, hoped they would have taken the Senate, and riding off of that, he would have used it as a springboard to announce his candidacy. Fortunately for him, that did not happen, and I think you kind of saw that in his speech. To me, he seemed to lack energy. He wasn't quite as bombastic as we've seen before. He was kind of a more toned down, almost sullen. So I really think it wasn't the speech he wanted to give. He thought he would have had a great big victory, and he would use that to launch his candidacy, but he wouldn't have backed down from a statement he made. So, yeah, I think Donald Trump didn't do himself a big favor with his announcement.
I definitely want to talk about Trump, his announcement, and also what his presidential campaign for the Republican nomination looks like a bit later. But to finish with Georgia, Herschel Walker did have a lot of scandals right before the election. Were you surprised that we're even going to a runoff based on that, or that the margin was so small?
I think American politics doesn't necessarily surprise you anymore. If anything, I'm not surprised that Warnock came out on top in the margins. I think, once again, as we saw in the results, Kemp did have a sizable margin over Stacey Abrams, and I think that does have an effect on how the votes do split. I think it's even surprising to see how there is that ticket splitting in Georgia. So, if anything, I guess from a candidate quality standpoint, it is surprising that Warnock wasn't able to get more than 50% of the vote. But I think him even getting over Walker is still tantamount to the scandals that Walker was facing throughout the race.
Yeah, I'd have to agree. I was a little surprised that Herschel Walker seemed to survive the scandals well enough to get to a runoff. He was a candidate who kind of ran on, traditional fundamental values, and then when it comes out that you've paid for multiple abortions, I'm not quite sure how he survived the optics of that, but, to your point about ticket splitting, American politics is interesting to say the least. Yeah.
Definitely, and I think ticket splitting was one of the general election trends that surprised a lot of people. What would you attribute that to? Would you say it's due to the Republican and Democrat strategies that caused this, or due to candidate popularity, or anything else really?
I think it really had to do with you have a Democratic control over the presidency and Congress, but you also have a Republican Party that nominated a lot of election deniers on the ticket and also had a lot of candidates that were just too extreme for voters. And I think when you are taking into account both of those qualities, that's where you're going to get that ticket splitting. And I really think the defining feature of the 2022 midterm elections is that it was all state by state. Some states were good for Democrats, some states weren't. Some states were good for Republicans, and some states weren't. So I think this was very much a balancing type of election where we weren't seeing that red wave, but we were seeing different reactions in different parts of the country.
Yeah, I definitely want to touch on how I think Republicans did not do themselves any favors with candidate quality. I think you saw that they had a lot of candidates who voters found were just too extreme. Doug Mastriano, candidate for Pennsylvania governor, was actually at January 6th. You can find the pictures anywhere. You have many election deniers running. You had candidates running on, the overturning of Roe and the complete abortion ban. And I think voters just found that that's too extreme. I think this country does not lean incredibly far to the left or the right. Just as a whole, it's fairly centrist. So I think Republicans lean too far to the right on that one. I think it absolutely hurt them.
Talking about party strategy, definitely right now, the Republican Party's quite upset at Mitch McConnell and blames him for a lot of the support for these extreme candidates. And also we saw that House Speaker Nancy Pelosi is stepping back from her position there. Along with that, we saw the only Gen Z, the first Gen Z member of Congress elected. Do you think for both parties, is this a shift on what their identity is, what their values is, and how they present to voters?
I think with the Democratic Party, I don't think that there's going to be too much of change. But with the Republican Party, I think that's where it comes down to it. I mean, the 2024 Republican Party primaries are going to be in full swing very much soon. I think Trump's announcement has really put right into focus what the Republican Party is going to have to do, not only for 2024, but just in general as a party. I think in terms of the youngness, the Democratic Party is definitely taking it on that front. But then on the Republican side, I think it's really coming down to what are the type of candidates that we want, and was the strategy that we thought was going to give us a red wave in 2022 really worth it, or do we just have to abandon it?
Nick?
Yeah, I just want to touch on the young voters. I think for the first time, we really saw young voters turn out in high numbers. Despite, most people think young people are very politically active, but statistically speaking, up until these midterm elections, they do not turn out in as high numbers as other age groups. So I think we saw young voters help deliver all things considered, a decent midterm election to the Democrats. And I think for the Republican Party, I feel like they've had a lot of fork in the road moments, but they're going to have another. If they, for 2024, if they want to throw themselves at the feet of Donald Trump again, and Trumpism and all that stands for, that's going to be, I think, potentially damaging in the future, because as you saw, Trumpist candidates did not fare as well. There is a more moderate faction of the Republican Party represented by Ron DeSantis, Glenn Youngkin, Larry Hogan, people like that. And I think that path might stand a better chance in a future presidential election, but I don't know if that's the path they're going to choose. I could absolutely see Donald Trump as the nominee for 2024.
Undeniably, and I think before we get into the fight that appears to be coming between President Trump and Governor DeSantis for the Republican presidential nomination, I want to end with, we mentioned that young voters tended to go for Democrats, but Democrats have relied on the Hispanic vote nationwide for a long time as one of their most established demographics. In Arizona and Nevada, this was still the case. Voters largely stuck with Democrats, but in heavy immigrant areas like Miami-Dade County in Florida and South Texas, the GOP won over that demographic. Does this signal a shift of Hispanic voters towards the GOP?
I think Hispanic voters in the United States have not been monolithic for a long time. Especially in Miami-Dade County. Bush Jr. had done relatively well with Hispanic voters in his elections. I think the shift that we're seeing is that it's becoming a little bit more solid in South Texas, a little bit more solid in Miami-Dade County. And I think in that circumstance, that's where the Republican Party is doing quite well. And I think the Democratic Party, what it's struggling with is how to communicate to these communities differentially on their issues, because not every single Hispanic or Latino voter is going to be the exact same. There are different values. There's definitely the influence of religion. So I think in terms of the Republican Party, they are taking advantage of that moment. And for the Democrats, that is a place where they do have to rethink their strategy if they want to continue to build on that multiracial, multicultural coalition of voters.
Nick?
Couldn't agree more. I think that's an oversight by the Democrats that for a while they treated Hispanic voters as a monolith. We have Hispanic voters, in our coalition, and they're solid and they're all the same. A Cuban voter in Miami-Dade County is very different than a recent immigrant to Arizona or Nevada. So, definitely about that point. And I'll just say about South Texas quickly is there were 3 competitive House districts there. Democrats won 2 of them, so while the area is becoming more Republican, that's certainly the long-term trend, Democrats still did okay there. And, Nevada, Arizona, two, many competitive races, Hispanic voters, helped swing the election to Democrat candidates. So I wouldn't be too quick to, declare that Hispanic voters are all in with the GOP.
Definitely, and I think with that, even though we had the midterms, the news story this week has been President Trump announcing his presidential campaign. Republicans have stuck with President Trump through thick and thin, including the Access Hollywood tapes, the Charlottesville, and even the Capitol riots. Now that a lot of people are saying that he lost the GOP 2 elections, are the Republicans going to stick by him, or is there going to be a party division due to his campaign?
I think that Republicans are not necessarily, I don't think that they're going to avoid him, but I think that they're going to be careful. Opinion polling ahead of the primary shows that there are other candidates, namely Governor Ron DeSantis of Florida. But I think they want to be careful. I think the strategy that they had coming into the 2022 midterm elections is that they could not avoid the Trump base. They couldn't isolate the Trump base, or else they just weren't going to get the votes. And I think they thought that if they could lean into candidates that were similar to Trump, whether they were election deniers, whether they still had maybe pro-life positions on abortion, that they could still win a lot of those key races. And that just wasn't the case. So I think for the Republican Party, they do want to be careful, because it is very much possible that Trump can win those Republican Party presidential primaries. You cannot count Trump out. That's the one thing to learn about American politics, is that Trump cannot be counted out. And I think for the Republicans, they're just going to have to wait and see. I think that you're going to, I think an important thing is that Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell had said that he wants to stay out of the presidential race. And I think that's going to be the sign for the Republicans. They're going to stay, a lot of national Republicans are going to be staying out. They're going to see what happens, and they're going to take the result as they are and move into 2024.
Nick?
Yeah, and I think one point that I'd like to touch on is there's been a lot of talk of, okay, well, Trump's lost, maybe it's time to ditch him. Oh, Ron DeSantis, big victory, maybe he should be the future. I don't know if Trump's base is going to buy that. That might be, it may very well be true that Trump is not the best candidate for 2024, but not in the base's eyes. They are going to be with him through thick and thin. They've been with him through all those things mentioned, and they're going to be with him for many more things. I don't think you're going to see them abandon him at any point. It's almost like a cult of personality at this point. So it's going to come down to the more moderate Republicans. Trump won in 2016, was obviously able to garner support from at least some of them and some independent voters. I don't know if Trump can build that coalition in 2024 again, but like my colleague said, you can't count him out. He's going to have that base with him, and they turn out. They show up on election day and they vote.
And with that, I kind of want to touch on what you said about moderate voters. I think we can definitely say Trump's base is going to vote for him no matter what. There's no candidate that can beat him in their eyes, but he does need that moderate Republican vote to win a presidential election. Why he won the electorate over Hillary Clinton, even though she had the popular vote, was due to the moderate voters that were centrist, that didn't go too far to the left, like you said, or too far to the right, that beat her in states that Democrats kind of counted on. So with that, you mentioned that Republican Party in this midterm election did support a lot of election deniers and candidates that a lot of voters consider to be extremist. And they did perform poorly on election day. Do you think that this should mean that the Republican Party needs to actually distance themselves from these candidates and from Trump to be able to win the presidential election?
I think the biggest lesson to learn, and this was a lesson that the Republican Party honestly should have learned in 2010, is you have to be careful when you are going to be nominating extreme candidates. I mean, it should go without saying, be careful about the quality of the candidates that you're putting up, but I think that's the repeat of what happened in 2022. There just were a lot of statewide and even congressional candidates that lost very important elections for the GOP. And I think that's going to be a lesson that they do need to learn at the congressional and the state level. I think with the presidential level, that becomes a lot more difficult because everything gets determined at the primary level. And the GOP, as a party, I think is very careful of trying to show any way that they would want another type of candidate instead of Trump. There can be an argument that there are Republican presidential candidates out there that would fare better in a general election compared to Trump. But at the end of the day, a lot of Trump-endorsed candidates won in their Republican primaries. It's hard to say whether that would continue and it would go into Trump's favor. But like I said before, I think the GOP is really trying to just weigh the waters and see what they can do. Because they obviously want to win the presidential election in 2024. They don't want to see the death of their party in doing so.
Nick?
Just quick story. The other day, Pat Toomey, former Republican senator from Pennsylvania, was on CNN. He was beside himself. He was dismayed. He was talking about the results in PA. Fetterman won, Shapiro won. There were 3 competitive House districts. Democrats won them all. And the point he made was, Republicans elected nominated extreme candidates, and they just did not fare well. Trump lost popular vote in 2016, lost the election in 2020, despite what he says. And he helped propel his party to a very disappointing midterms. Joe Biden is not an incredibly popular president. Historical trends suggested that this should have been a much larger Republican victory, and yet he managed to help negate that. So one would think it's time to move on. But I don't know if they will. I really don't. Conventional wisdom suggests, yes, time to move on. This guy has lost us elections. I don't know if they will. I really don't. I think the base is going to be behind him. I don't mean to discredit potential hands, but people talked about DeSantis' victory, but Charlie Crist wasn't the greatest candidate ever invented. Glenn Youngkin's only a one-term governor. Larry Hogan, some of these other options. I don't know if they can defeat Trump in a primary. I don't know if they can bring the base with them. Even if they do attract moderate voters, it's going to be about turning out the base in the primaries to get yourself the nomination. So, yeah, I will not be writing Trump off anytime soon.
We're going to wrap up right now, but I want to ask one last question. You mentioned Governor DeSantis. He was one of the earliest calls of the night on Election Day, and he did win by quite a large margin. And we have seen that President Trump has already started attacking DeSantis and credited himself for his first governor win. You talked about having a candidate that can stand up to Trump on a federal level, on a national level. Do you think DeSantis can do that or no?
It's very hard to say. I will say DeSantis is probably, as of right now, the strongest challenge to Trump for the Republican nomination in 2024. It's hard to say whether throughout the campaign DeSantis will be able to win, but I think DeSantis matches a lot of the similar policies of Trump. And in terms of Republican voters, especially in Florida, I think that they believe that DeSantis is carrying that vision in his own state and could carry that on to the national level without maybe some of the baggage that Trump has taken on over time. I do think it's important to keep in mind that DeSantis is a very similar candidate to Trump in essence. But as we said before, Trump has a different type of personality to him. And that is going to engage his base. And I think it's going to be that situation where we're not necessarily seeing a more conservative candidate compared to a more moderate candidate. I think we're just seeing which would we rather want on that ticket. Who do we want to see match up against the Democratic nominee in 2024?
Nick?
Well, from a Democrat perspective, I'd much rather face Trump than DeSantis. I mean, we've shown we can beat in Trump. A lot happened in 2 years, but I can't imagine Trump getting himself more popular with a broader base of voters, a broader coalition. But the thing about DeSantis is he's got the Trump-like policies. I think he's even got some of their charisma. He's an appealing figure. So if he's the nominee, he would bring the base with him, I think. But he can also appeal to a broad coalition. He has some Hispanic voters. When his railing on the culture wars, I think, really has attracted some suburban white women. He has a broader coalition than Trump. And so from that perspective, I think he'd be a more formidable candidate, but he didn't. I don't know if that's what's going to happen. DeSantis, I think for now, he's got the juice, but 14 months, who knows? Trump could re-engineer himself with a comeback, I think Trump is going to be an absolute force with the Republican Party. He very well may be nominee again.
Well, thank you so much. That's going to be the last word for now. When we come back, we're going to talk about the international arena and what it's telling us about the future. Stay tuned.
Raise high. This isn't just our battle cry. It's our call, our challenge. Because when you were called to Washington, you were called to higher expectations, to a higher standard. We are called here to advance knowledge, to serve society, to change the world. Is that too lofty? Too aspirational? Is it simply too much to expect? Not if your classroom is a Smithsonian, the IMF, or on the doorstep of the Supreme Court. Not if you have access to the most hallowed institutions and formidable leaders. Not if you are given the tools to change minds, shape laws, influence entire fields of study, advance our way of life, change the course of history. From the nation's capital to the four corners of the earth, to far below the surface and far beyond our atmosphere, here, unique opportunities, the ones that many people work much of their lives to get, are within your reach from the moment you arrive. This is where you find new pathways for preventing global epidemics, where your unexpected friend propels a new scientific movement forward. This is where you push forward as a team to break records and reach new heights. Where your classroom is 68 square miles of the most consequential land on Earth. This is where you will make it happen. This is the George Washington University, and what we make is history. So stand up, be bold, take risks, press on, push harder, raise high.
Welcome back to Capitol Crossfire. We're back with the Knicks today, and we're going to talk about what is going on in the international arena. As we speak, the United Nations Climate Change Conference is happening. The war between Ukraine and Russia is evolving in the diplomatic arena. And is China changing their policy in relation to Taiwan? So to begin, like I said, the Climate Change Conference is occurring, and Coca-Cola is one of the headline sponsors for it, which has been the top plastic polluter for 5 years in a row. Should corporations be prevented from greenwashing their brands through supporting international conferences such as this?
I think, yes, in a word. I mean, just the optics are just terrible. COP27 is supposed to help, promote climate change efforts. One of the big ones is plastic pollution. And then when you're sponsored by the single biggest plastic producer, that's a problem. I think it just gives off the image that, there's not going to be substantive change. I mean, it's an empty gesture. They gather because they want to appear that they care about climate change, but there's not going to be any big changes. It's sad to see, but not unexpected.
Yeah, I'm not gonna lie. I didn't think that they needed Coca-Cola as a sponsor. I didn't know that we were getting brands to sponsor these events.
Was this the World Cup?
Yeah, I agree with Nick. I mean, it's a big error in judgment. It's definitely not representative of the point of the summit, and I think that going forward they should not only try and avoid this from that type of standpoint, but I think the money part is something that they need to kind of avoid somewhat. I'm a little bit confused as to the involvement of the sponsor itself and what that money is going towards. But I do think, from the imaging standpoint, it's concerning, but also because this is an international conference, the conversations that are happening might be even more concerning.
Yeah, and I think kind of just to finalize on that, you both mentioned that based on the optics, this appears to be a lot of empty promises that could be made at the conference. And I think a lot of voters around the world, a lot of people around the world feel like these summits are exactly that countries are going and they're not making any concrete commitments that they will actually apply to combat climate change. Do you think this is the case?
Unfortunately, I do. I mean, when one of the largest emission producing countries, the U.S., can just withdraw from a climate agreement, it doesn't send the message that, okay, this is binding and this is going to have a real effect. And I mean, it's just unfortunate, the change is long overdue. It needs to happen now, but it just doesn't seem like there's a drive to do that among the countries. This is what the people want. People want climate reform, climate justice, and all that, but it's just not something that the leaders appear to be a fan of.
Yeah, and I would definitely agree with that. I think in terms of the concrete solutions, that's just going to be what, I think that's the overarching message of tackling climate change is it really the important issue that it's being said to be? And that's where, you have that absence of concrete solutions being proposed, and especially, going back to our talk about Coca-Cola being a sponsor, is there actually a divide in what we're doing? Are these countries and governments actually trying to serve in a more checks and balances type way, accountability type way? And I think when you're involving corporations or you're just taking corporations at their word, that can be a very, very concerning, red line that you're crossing. But I think, to Nick's point, that's just something that's expected.
Yeah, and like I mentioned, the United Nations is the one kind of structuring the conference. And symbolic, whether these international bodies are symbolic or not, they do hold an important place in diplomacy. And with that, kind of Ukrainian President Zelensky has been pushing the G19 in international media by floating the idea that Russia shouldn't be allowed to participate. Do you think that Russia should be included in international bodies like the G20, the UN, and UNSC? Which when they are actually violating a lot of the regulations that they establish?
I think, I think Ukraine has their vested interest in wanting Russia out of these bodies. I think, in these bodies' perspectives from what they are seeing, I think that is something that they are going to have to consider. I think, especially as we're seeing the conflict continue to go through, I think that for a lot of these bodies, the best solution for them might be to remove Russia or to definitely hold them accountable for these regulations. It's definitely hard to say as to what they would rather want or what, which do they want to break, because at the same time they have to consider what allies to Russia might desire best in the outcome. But I think it's a difficult choice, but if it comes to that time, I think that Russia might get kicked out.
Nick?
Yeah, this is a tough one because, on one hand, Russia, if Russia does get kicked out of these bodies, that could contribute to an increasing feeling of isolation, and that's kind of why Russia's acting the way it is. Their logic is, okay, Ukraine is under the West, under the influence of the West, and the West is against us, and we're being attacked. So if Russia's getting kicked out of international bodies, I do wonder if that could feel that sense. At the same time, Russia isn't exactly beholden to international communities. It's more isolated state. It can operate with Putin and its oligarchs. Without regard for the welfare of the people, but the Russian state can pretty much prop itself out of the same 20 people. So, but when you are openly flouting rules and regulations, I think that's grounds for removal. This wasn't mentioned, but sports, just even in that sense, Russia is suspended from FIFA for violating, for obvious reasons. So we've seen some precedent. Yeah, I'd have to lean yes, just with that caveat in mind.
Yeah, and I think in the U.S. perspective, President Biden has been a vocal opponent and has supported Ukraine against the Russian invasion. If Ukraine makes a firm stand that Russia should be kicked out of these international bodies, do you think the Biden administration should support that and help them to make that case?
I think it's a very complex, situation for the Biden administration when it comes to international politics. I think that there definitely is that willingness from the Biden administration to support Ukraine as much as possible. I could see that definitely happening, but I also think the distinction I would make to Nick's comment is when we're talking about the symbolic removal of Russia from something like an international body, like a sports body, or even from a competition, I think that's a whole nother territory. I think we also have to put into perspective that, especially with sports, that deals more with the Russian government's involvement in doping violations. And I think that can be distinguished between the other, but I do think once you're getting into the international arena, that's where it carries a lot more weight when you're trying to hold Russia accountable, because that means you're now on different turf with Russia, you're on different turf with the countries that support Russia, and now you have to take into the consequences that can have for your own country, but that can have for the other countries around them, especially with worrisome reports coming from the war currently.
Nick?
The one thing I will say is I do absolutely think the Biden administration should support Ukraine in any way possible. It is a balancing act without trying to alienate Russia too far, and we've seen some tensions inflared with that balance. But the one thing I will say is there's been it's very small. It's two people, okay? It's Marjorie Taylor Greene and Matt Gaetz that recently called for an audit into the Biden administration's financial support for the Ukrainian military. And so, I don't know. To that point, I think it's very interesting that we, here in the U.S., we're starting to see pushback against supporting Ukraine, even though, Ukraine's fighting for things that the overwhelming majority of Americans would find, valuable. Democracy, self-determination, freedom, all those things. So, yeah, I think it absolutely is a balancing act, but Biden administration should be supporting Ukraine in any way they can. If you remember, Ukraine wanted troops, Ukraine wanted a no-fly zone, so Biden administration isn't giving them a blank check or anything, but they're supporting them in the way they can while maintaining the balancing act.
And for one of our last questions, China and the U.S. agreed to resume climate talks after an extended hiatus, put in place in large part because of the U.S. recent comments and policy on Taiwan. Do you think this means that China is opening up on its strict enforcement on Taiwan, or are they acting in other interests such as climate change?
I think that they definitely have not let up on their policy. I think that they gave no indication that they were going to let up. I think China is very firm. I think with the talks, Biden, if anything, was the reversal. I think Biden was trying to show that he was for the one China policy, but that for him, if China was going to go further for Taiwan, that the U.S. would then need to get more involved. But China gave no recurse that they were going to lay up on the policy. If anything, they were like, well, if you violate the policy and you do what we don't want you to do, consequences are going to come for you. So I think that there definitely are other interests at hand, might even be separate from that issue entirely, but I don't think that China is necessarily letting up on that policy. And I don't think that the government gave any indication that they were going to let up at all.
Nick?
For the U.S., it's a tricky position. The official position on Taiwan for the U.S. is strategic ambiguity. We don't officially say whether we will support Taiwan or we won't. So that strategy it's supposed to be confusing because if we say, we wouldn't help. That's basically saying, China, go ahead. But if we say we would defend, that's setting the stage up for a potential, conflict, which we would all want to avoid. So I think that's why we have the policy. I think it's, the U.S., probably in China's eyes, the U.S. has gotten a little more pro-Taiwan. Biden, in his 60 Minutes interview, said he would defend Taiwan. He walked that back. Nancy Pelosi went to Taiwan. So I think the climate talks are, it's a smart tactic by China, because climate change is something that we absolutely need China's participation in. They're a big emitter. They're a developing country. They have, not a developing country, but they have massive population. They still use coal. They sell coal to developing countries. So we absolutely need China in climate talks. But I think what I would imagine is China was using this as leverage to try and get the U.S. to maybe walk back a little bit, support Taiwan, maybe back towards a more ambiguous policy.
Absolutely, and I think, for final question, and perhaps our most controversial one, who are you rooting for in the World Cup?
Okay, that's
The gasp.
So, not gonna lie, I'm Portuguese, so definitely would love to see a Portugal win once in my lifetime. But also, in my opinion, I don't think that Portugal is going to be able to win the World Cup. But what I'm rooting for is Brazil. I think Brazil has a very good shot. I think they are in good territory. I might be wrong in saying that. I've been away from the football era for a while, but I'm rooting for Brazil to win.
Nick?
Can I just ask you a quick question first? Do you like Fernando Santos, or do you think he's setting up the team the wrong way?
Like I said, I don't know much at the point. I mostly just root for football for country or family reasons. But if you say that he's setting it up, I'll take your word for it.
Well, unfortunately, I'm not a big fan of your manager. I think you guys have way too much talent to be playing the way you guys do play, which is defensive and fairly boring. So I'm Italian, and Italy did, I don't want to talk about it, but we didn't do so good. I'll probably be rooting for Argentina.
For the only definitive one that I will give, I am hoping the French win another World Cup.
Oh, that's embarrassing.
Oh, no.
That's embarrassing. Nick supports Italy, and they won the Euro Cup and didn't make the World Cup.
Yeah, it's
okay. Well, that's all for this episode of Capital Crossfire. Thank you to the Nicks, Nicholas Anastacio and Nick Fattizzo, for being with us today, and also Jacob Khabie for his great analysis at the beginning. Be sure to check us out online at gwtv.com and follow us on Twitter and Instagram, and like us on Facebook. For all of us at GWTV, I'm Emmanuelle Dyer Melhado. Thank you for getting caught in the crossfire with us. We'll see you back here next time.